Now, Walt Disney had a massive part in this film, yeah. Probably more so than any of the other films that were to come out at a later point, because obviously he produced them. But for this was really his idea, yeah, because like we said in the previous video, no one had ever tried to do a feature-length animated film before, yeah, not like this. So this was really revolutionary stuff, yeah. Like, so before this, they just done like little like short clips of like different cartoons and stuff. So Disney pitched the idea to his staff, and he acted out the entire film, right? Well, obviously, like this, like before, it had certain tweaks and stuff. But yeah, so he acted out the entire film to his staff and sold the idea to them. This is in 1934. The film took 3 years to make, but yeah, so in 1934 he did this. Now, there's a main writer called Richard Creedon, and in total they end up having 8 writers for this film, which, you know, is not uncommon within like Hollywood and stuff to have multiple different script writers for things, right? And most of the meetings that they had was to do with the different so-called gags and screwiness, yeah, right? So this is all the different like jokes that are within this, because what you tend to find, especially with a lot of like comedy writing, you tend to have lots of different writers, yes, so then they can kind of bounce ideas off of each other, right? So most of the film is just taken up with different screen time where it's dealing with this. So the names of the 7 dwarfs, yeah, were decided out of a pool of 50 names. And actually some of the names, which end up being picked later, did not end up being what the 7 dwarfs were called. So the 7 dwarfs, you got Doc, you got Grumpy, you got Bashful, you got Sleepy, and you got Happy, right? So these are like 5 names that they managed to pick. And then there was going to be 6 and 7, right? So the 6th one was going to be called Jumpy, right? And the 7th was going to be called the 7th. And this person was meant to be deaf and lively, as they describe it. Now, the thing with Walt Disney is that he decided that each of the dwarfs was going to have their own character, and they're going to have their own names. Because in the original story, there's like a main dwarf, and then all the rest of them are just called the other 6 dwarfs, right? They don't have any personalities. So what he wanted was for each character to have their own personality and to have a name that reflected that. And so that's why they have all these kind of like goofy names, right? So it's quite interesting to note, yeah, that Sneezy and Dopey, yeah, arguably some of the like best known characters, especially Dopey, yeah. You know, my granddad used to call me Dopey for obvious reasons, still probably does, and again, obvious reasons. But yeah, so that's why we look at like the story of the creator, because it's always quite interesting to see the creative process that goes into the kind of character development, because whenever you're looking at any kind of like book or any kind of like film, etc., these characters aren't real, they've been created, yeah, and so someone's had to think them up and think what are they like, right? And I say this as a script writer myself, like kind of this is some of the process that you kind of like look into. And then also as well, actually, the final thing I'll say with regard to the creator side of the thing is that the Queen was originally going to be fat and batty, right? So if you look at quite a lot of Disney villains, so some of them are just scary and evil, and some of them are kind of just like a bit dopey and a bit kind of like, you know, they're just idiots, right? And what they wanted with Snow White was they decided that the Queen needed to be more statesmanly, or like more stateswomanly, you know, so she had to be a more intimidating character, yeah, and therefore they decided against her being fat and batty, because they thought that when she transformed into a witch, it wouldn't be as scary. And I think that they were quite right to make that decision. I think it would have been, it's a lot more believable making the transition from one to the other than from like fat and batty to the other, right? So yeah, so that kind of covers the story of the creator. So now we're going to be talking about the story of the studio. So as we said before in the last video, you know, the animation was a very long process. That's part of the reason why it took up to 3 years to make this film. And, you know, the animation in those days, each frame had to be drawn by hand, and it was a very kind of long and laborious process. But, you know, the artwork, considering how long it took, they really didn't like kind of like cut corners. In a lot of the later Disney films you see, there's not much like kind of depth. But with this, you know, each frame is like a piece of art, yeah. They really kind of have thought about it. And also as well, something to note is that Snow White is the only Disney film that the Disney Corporation still to this day does not have the rights to. So the reason for that is because at a much later point, you know, Disney had their own music publishing company within the corporation, but up until that point they had to use different companies, yeah. So I can't remember the exact company name for this one, but I have it on screen now. So in subsequent films, they were able to kind of like buy up the rights to the films that have been made already. However, this company here refused to sell it to Disney, and so yeah, so Disney does not have the rights to Whistle While You Work, to Hi Ho, to any of the songs that were in that, right? So all the music, all the songs, they don't own anything still, right? And then also as well, something to note is that Adriana Caselotti, I think that's how you pronounce her last name. So this is the voice of Snow White. Now, as would happen in a lot of films in those days, in particular a lot of animated films, people wouldn't get credited for their role. And so even though she's the voice of Snow White, you expect that to be obviously like, you know, to have quite like high status and for her career to be able to take off. She at the time only got paid $970, right? And when you adjust that for inflation, that's just $18,000. Now, obviously, you could kind of say, okay, well, Disney Corporation at the time wasn't that big, and yada yada, and that's a kind of a fair point to make. However, because she was uncredited, it meant that she then struggled to get jobs in the acting business throughout the rest of her life. So I think one of the last films she was in was It's a Wonderful Life, and even for that, she's not credited. She's like one of the singers in one of the bar scenes that they have there. So it's really tragic that like someone who was in, you know, starred in such a high like a grossing film, as we'll talk about in a little bit, the fact that she struggled with the rest of her career kind of shows you how the you know the entertainment industry, especially in those days, yeah, and even still to an extent these days, right, is still a really cutthroat business, right? So I just want you to kind of understand that the art that people put into things isn't always rewarded as it should be. Right, now we're talking about the themes and the history, right? So obviously this is the 1930s where this film's coming out. It's the, you know, the Great Depression. People are like really depressed and stuff, obviously. You know, World War II hasn't really started yet, but kind of, you know, people are very worried about like this kind of looming war. And so they want a kind of like escapism at this moment in time. And so they want kind of very kind of standard kind of stories. They want kind of like romantic love. That's a major theme of it, obviously. And kind of thing of like triumphing over evil, also as well like kind of people, you know, the witch obviously is exploiting a good-natured person and stuff, and so it's one of those kind of like life lessons for like, you know, stranger danger, like don't just trust people on the face of it. Also as well, obviously it being the 1930s, there's very traditional gender roles, right? So Snow White comes in, she cooks and cleans for the men go off to work. And she didn't have a job other than that. So all she's left to do is sit and wait for Prince Charming. So it's not like let's become an accountant or let's like do something else. Instead, it's like, yeah, let's just wait for Prince Charming to come and save me. So obviously there's kind of like romantic love that they kind of like were focused on those days, and the kind of traditional gender roles, right? But also, yeah, like with most films, there ends up being influence from other films that come out at the same time. So Disney really encouraged his writers to go and watch a bunch of different films that were coming out, both American films and like kind of international films. So for instance, you know, so like we said, the film comes out in 1937. In 1936, you know, the writers go and watch Romeo and Juliet. So obviously this is the Shakespeare story, but this had been made into a film in 1936. And watching that, especially with this like glass coffin that they have in that film, really influenced the writers for Snow White. So that's why she ends up being in a glass coffin. Also as well, the transformation of the Queen going into the witch, that was influenced by Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So obviously that's a classic story from the 19th century. However, this had been turned into a film in 1931. So again, this really heavily influenced the people, right? And also as well, there was a lot of German expressionist films which came out in the 1920s. So obviously this is Weimar Germany. This is before the no-no Germans come in. And you know, I don't want to get demonetized, whatever, YouTube's weird like that. But anyway, so in those days with like Weimar Germany, people were a lot more expressive, and like they kind of were dealing with a lot of like dark issues and stuff, because obviously it was just after World War One. So a lot of the kind of like really scary scenes were in that, like the kind of you know, the witches scenes, and then also like running through the forest and stuff at the beginning. A lot of the artwork in that is heavily influenced by the expressionists, yeah, at the time, yes, the German expressionists. So yeah, so that was some of the influences that went into Snow White, and you can kind of see that when you're watching it.